Hi everybody, and welcome again to another English Lab video here to help you out with your studying for the English exam. And today again we're working with argument analysis, and this is a follow-up video to our 2019 section C video that we'll put a link up to right now if you haven't yet seen it. But today we're going to go through some actual sample pieces that I've put together for you just to give you an idea of what you can do after you've been able to annotate well, after you've been able to find and identify more things out of those arguments, how you can actually put those things together. So we're going to take a look at some introductions. We're going to take a look at some paragraphs, and those paragraphs are going to improve in quality as the video goes on. But as with all of our videos, there's something for everybody, I think, in each section of it. But we've tried to make sure that we're catering for all skill levels and wherever you might be with your study at the moment, in the aim that you can keep watching these things and keep improving yourselves as you go. And so if you haven't seen our original playlist of videos around argument analysis and the things to be doing in general as the best way to study for it, I'd really suggest that you take a look at those before you finish watching today's video. And if you haven't yet had a chance to see our original video on the Hailey Astaire 2019 section C piece, that would also be really useful as well. As always, make sure you put your questions down there in the comments. We'll be more than happy to help you out even further down there. And everything that you see today on your screen when it comes to the sample pieces that we've written will appear down there in the comments as well. We'll also link to the 2019 exam just to make sure that you've got everything that you need to help you with your studying. So let's jump in. And the first thing we're going to do is to take a look at how you can go about writing your introductions. And one thing that I want to make sure of with these videos is that it's not going to be a case of me saying this is the way that you must do it, or that there's the only way of doing it. So I'm going to present you with a couple of introductions that you'll be able to see there on your screen, one in purple and then one in a red text. And I want you to consider what's happening between the two of them. It's definitely not a case of one being horrible and one being really, really superior to the other. I would definitely argue that the second one, the one in red, is the superior introduction, but that's by no means a way for you to look at the first one and write it off and think that it's something that you shouldn't be doing. Rather, I want to point out to you what makes that second one that little bit better. And so depending on where you're at with your current skills in writing these pieces, the first introduction might be something that you're looking to strive to in terms of just being clear, putting out the arguments, putting out that understanding and getting started in a really clear way for the assessor to be able to read your piece and to put them in that frame of mind where you're showing them that you really understood what was going on and that you're going to give this a really good crack. Or if you're already at that point, you might want to look at the second one and think to yourself, okay, there's a few things here that I can be doing to really lift myself even further. And so let's take a look at this first one here in purple. Through her piece, A Better, Faster Shopping Experience, Hailey Astaire informs her customers of the upcoming changes at her local store. Speaking with a sense of excitement, Astaire points out that the store is going cashless and that this will help local customers with better service being offered. She aims to portray the changes as positive and leaves the local audience fully aware that this will be a smooth change. Samuel Morricone, a concerned local shopper, outlines his disgust with the proposed changes. Speaking bluntly and negatively, Morricone points out that the move will alienate some shoppers like his mother. And so, as I said, a pretty run-of-the-mill introduction, pretty clear, pretty direct in what it's saying, but there's probably a bunch of things that I feel that it could be doing better. But I do also want to point out some of the positives. The way in which the sentences start, it doesn't actually use the word tone. There's no law that says that students must identify the tone and students must use one of the select, 38 tone words and actually use the word tone itself. And so that sentence starter there, speaking with a sense of excitement, is a really great way of being able to start sentences in introductions as a way to make sure that you're taking that overall sort of view of how the language has come across. Astaire points out that the store is going cashless. Yep, that's what she's saying. And that this will help local customers with better service. She aims to portray. And so one thing that I want you to be really aware of is that we're talking about the intended effect of language. And so that means that we're going to talk about obviously the writer's intentions, what they were aiming to do, what they are looking to do to the reader, how they're looking to lead or coerce or move them or push them towards things, or, with those verbs that we've talked about, to challenge or to confront or to question readers. But we can't say things like she makes or she forces people to feel a certain way. And so that idea of aiming to portray the changes as positive is already giving that outline of argument and how it exists. Leaves the local audience. There's a nod to the audience and a nod to the fact that this person who's written this introduction has understood that they are local. The local audience fully aware that this will be a smooth change. So all in all, it's done everything that it needs to do. It's outlined a couple of the main arguments. It's talked about the contention of the piece, and it's given a nod towards the manner in which Astaire has gone about making those arguments. When it comes to Morricone, it has that nice little aside here where it says Samuel Morricone, comma, a concerned local shopper. Just that further information, a little bit of decoration in the writing, just to give it that little nod to the fact that, yep, I get this, that, Samuel Morricone isn't just some black and white figure, that actually he's involved, he's a local shopper, he's a part of this community, and so I understand that. Outlines his disgust with the proposed changes. And again, with the tone, doesn't actually use the word tone, bluntly and negatively. However, I would point out the fact that if the best tone word we can come up with is positive or negative, we need to go back to the well and try again. We don't want to be saying that he's speaking negatively. We can talk about, how they portray things or depict things in a negative light, but just saying that it was a negative tone is really, something that we'd need to consider doing better, I would say. Morricone points out the move will alienate some shoppers like his mother. Okay, so perhaps there's some language use in there that you've been able to pull out. Perhaps there's some ways that the sentences mold into each other that you think, actually, that could help me improve mine. Perhaps it's the brevity of it. Sometimes, you're only going to have an hour to write this piece in the exam. And so, perhaps just being able to make sure that you get to the point and don't spend too much time explaining an article that the assessor has read 22 times before they've marked your piece, maybe that's what you'll take out of that. But I want you to take a look at this one down here in the red or burgundy writing. And as I read through it, and as we read through it together, have a think about what you think it is that separates this from the first one. What it is that makes it that little bit better, and some of the things that it calls upon. In an effort to further improve the unique experience offered by her local store, Hailey Astaire has announced the plans for her supermarket to become cashless. Astaire speaks of the changes in an enlivened manner, looking to excite local shoppers through the benefits that this move will bring them. As she promotes the special nature of her store, Astaire aims to assure the reader that she has their best interests at heart, whilst encouraging them in that their moving with this change is merely part of keeping up with technology. One of Astaire's customers, Samuel Morricone, has replied to the advertorial with a letter of protest through which he urges fellow shoppers to see the change for its true intentions, as he questions the motives behind Astaire's actions. By speaking of his elderly mother, Morricone invites scepticism and anger from readers, as he paints the store's actions as being motivated purely by greed. And so it's easy for us to look at it and go, well, yeah, that one's better. But let's break it down and think about why and what it is that it has done that has made it that more rounded introduction. And an introduction that if I were reading it, I'd be thinking, well, this one's on a path to a more insightful analysis. One thing you will have seen if you've watched those other videos that I referenced earlier is that it's really important for you to be able to talk about the writer's intentions when it comes to what they're trying to do to the reader. And so I've often called that, making sure that we're looking at the purpose, not just the contention of a piece. And so we use verbs in order to get across that understanding of that purpose and what the writer is trying to do. And it can just give that more insightful analysis. And so this first thing that we see here is this idea of exciting the reader. And so we have that first idea of, looking to excite local shoppers, through the benefits that this move will bring them. She promotes the special nature of the of her store. She looks to assure her reader of these things, that she has their best interests in heart, whilst also encouraging them in that they're moving with this change is merely part of keeping up with technology. And so what you can notice there is that layering of these verbs. It's that way of showing in your introduction that I understand all of the things that this writer is trying to do to the reader. And it's not just one. It's not just they're looking to inspire them and then we move on. You know, there was that idea of looking to excite them, promote the special nature of the store. But then this line here where it says to assure the reader that she has their best interest at heart, whilst encouraging them, is just that extra layer of analysis, of being able to point out that you've understood the writer's intentions and you can analyse them to the point where you've understood that not only can I see one of the things that they're doing, but I can also see something else that they're doing simultaneously. A really insightful nod to the assessor to say, look, I really understand all that's going on with this piece. Of course, it continues on here with Morricone. He's replied, he urges fellow shoppers. So again, you know, what he is doing to the reader there, what he is looking to do as opposed to just what he is saying. By speaking of his elderly mother, you know, he questions the motives behind Astaire's actions. And then it points out, you know, the intention behind why he would talk about his elderly mother and that idea about inviting skepticism. And so again, a really clear understanding of what is being done to the reader there. And so that's just one thing you can do to improve your introductions. I've obviously spent a bit of time talking about those verbs. There are other things that are happening here in this introduction, and I'd be really curious to see what you thought about it and whether there were other things that you noticed in that introduction that really allowed it to get to a higher level than the first one there. Perhaps it was some of the sentence starters that you might want to now start using, or perhaps it was some of the way that some of those sentences blended into each other. No matter what it is, take a look through and have an understanding that introductions need to be direct and to the point. Notice I didn't say short, but direct and to the point, not spending time explaining the article or explaining what the writer has said over and over again, but rather being direct and ruthless in that understanding of these are all of the things that I've noticed that the writer has done. And as I say all of the things, I don't want you sitting there and worrying about the fact that, well, do I have to mention absolutely everything I noticed in the introduction? Of course not. Bring it back to those major arguments and those main ideas and arguments that you noticed from either of the writers, if there's two of them, or just the main writer if there's only the one. And then you'll obviously have time to go further with that later on in your analysis paragraphs. And so in our general video, and then in the 2019 reading video that are up there on our channel, I've talked about the idea of a nuts and bolts analysis. And the reason I use that term is that I want to make sure that I'm catering for all students, and that for those students that have found these things difficult, I want to provide some examples of those basic fundamentals of argument analysis that can get you going and get you on the right track. So all of the advice with the paragraph I'm about to show you is based on just meeting that minimum requirement when it comes to argument analysis and getting yourself going with these types of things. It can also be a great way for students who are finding this a little bit easier than others to be able to see that they still need to deal with the fundamentals as well, but things like their language use and their ability to introduce multiple audiences or go further with their analysis is what will make them stand out. But it can't hurt to take a look at some of the fundamentals. And so the paragraph that we're going to go through in this video is just taking a look at a really clear structure when it comes to writing an analysis and focusing on clear links back to how the language leads the reader to think, act or feel, and also how we can always find plenty of material if we think about how the writer portrays themselves and how the specific audience that is there, if we put a bit of thought into that, how that can give us plenty of ammunition for things to write about later on as well. So if you read along with me here, you'll see Hailey Astaire portrays herself as a leader of a store that is a bit different. Through this, she encourages the reader to see her as a strong leader and as someone who will provide them with an experience that is more focused on them as a local. And so a really great sentence starter that I'm encouraging you to use if you're finding this area of study really difficult are these two words here, through this. Because it just means that you are triggering yourself towards analysis if you are able to point out your understanding that you've just mentioned an argument and now you're getting back to this idea of through this it's going to move you towards that analysis of why that has been done. Because if you follow those two words with the correct sort of sentence afterwards, you're going to get to something like, encourages the reader to see her as a strong leader. That's argument analysis at its core. The reason that she said that it's a bit different is because she wants to encourage the reader to see her as a strong leader, and as someone who will provide them with an experience that is more focused on them as a local. And so right off the bat here in this first paragraph, I've got two ways that language has worked to influence a reader, or two ways that I have been able to point out that she has used a certain quote and done a certain thing, used a certain argument, this idea of putting herself out there as a certain type of person, and I've been able to analyze the intended effect of why she has done that. That is argument analysis. If I can do that over and over and over again, I'm writing an effective piece. If I can then improve my language use and improve the depth to which I can analyze these things, that's when I can start to climb the ladder of success with this area of study. But at its core, being able to find a quote, follow that with through this, and then get to an impact of how that quote or that argument will lead a reader to think, act, and feel, gets you doing the job at that fundamental level. And sometimes that's just the push we need if we've been finding it difficult to start with. Let's keep reading. Her mention of her being in the store every day allows the reader to see her as dedicated and hardworking. And so what has happened here is that we've got this second form of evidence under that same umbrella of this is how Astaire wants to put herself forward. So I've got a paragraph that has this overarching idea of one of the things Astaire does to try and persuade people of her contention and of what she's trying to do to them is the way that she portrays herself. I've now got a second piece of evidence to show a different way that she's looked to do that. So my paragraph is starting to fill out. Again, I've got all of the evidence and the impact of that evidence, the intended impact of that evidence, all in the one sentence. When we see here this word that allows that to happen, which is that actual word itself, allows. So we can notice that when I have that quote and I then use the word allows the reader, it puts me in a position where I can get to that impact again. And we see here that it is allows her to see her as dedicated and hardworking. Now, I would say that if you just finished it there, you would have done maybe half the job. You would have just said, yeah, that word equals, that they'll see her as, hardworking and dedicated. Look at what this next sentence does. And this can be something that, for our nuts and bolts sort of fundamental understanding that we can use to really improve ourselves, because we're not just going to write quote impact over and over again. This is something, a little step we can do to improve our analysis tenfold. This can further lead readers. So it's talking about this idea of, all right, I've talked about one of the impacts. Now I'm going to talk about how it can even take them further, and it can also do something else to admire her and what she aims to do for them as local shoppers. So take the time, maybe grab that paragraph from in the transcript that we've put there in the comments, and take a look at the way that the language works in order to get from the quote or the evidence or the understanding of argument to the impact. And really, once you get that going and once you have a few structures up your sleeve where you've got that language that allows you to do that, argument analysis just becomes about rinse and repeat in making sure that you're doing that for all of the arguments that you noticed. Of course, we can improve upon it later on, but that is a really great place to start. There's a second paragraph just to really reiterate those points. And we can see it here when it says, being a local store, the supermarket may also come across as being customer-centered to readers, leading them to feel that they are well taken care of as a member of the community. And so this paragraph is really considered who is the audience. And if you've watched those earlier videos, you will have noticed that we've always talked about the fact that on the exam, there's most likely going to be that really clear understanding of who the audience is. It might be a local issue, or it might be something that's been sent to parents of a sporting team or a primary school. But there is going to be that way for you to be able to think, who is this exact audience and what language can I pull out of there that I can talk about the fact where I know that that language has been used for that audience. And so this one has talked about customer-centered and local. Astaire's point that that's what you asked us to do establishes that she has a connection with the local community and that she is here for them. And I'm going to stop it there just for a moment to point out to you that This sentence, as nice as it is, Astaire's point that that's what you asked us to do, hasn't actually got to any analysis yet. And sometimes there are students who stop after writing a sentence like this because they say things like, yeah, well, it establishes a connection. That's not an analysis of why she has used that or an analysis of how it impacts the reader. That's telling me what it does, that it establishes a connection. And sometimes students stop just that half step before they actually get to the analysis. Notice what it goes on to with this next sentence. Readers are led to feel welcomed and looked after, and there's the impact. There's that think, act, feel. And so a really good audit you can do of your own work is to read through yours and start highlighting where you actually get to that think, act, feel. And so obviously with this one, if I was to be doing that with my own work, I'd be saying, well, it says feel welcomed and looked after. That's where I've got to the think, act, feel, and that's where I could be ticking off that I'm doing the job. If I hadn't have written this sentence and I had just said, look, that she does that to connect, to create a connection with the local community, I'm not quite getting the job done all the way. So in summary, for our nuts and bolts, our fundamentals of argument analysis, make sure we're aware of the language that's going to lead us to analysis. Through this, she encourages. This quote allows the reader to see. All of these types of words are the triggers that get us on the road to analysing language effectively. And of course, then as well, making sure that we consider the writer and who that writer is, because we can be pretty confident that there'll be material for that in the exam, no matter who the writer is. And of course, also considering the audience. That's a major part of it as well. And then lastly, with that last point that we brought up, doing an analysis of our own work and actually going through and checking, have we always come back to how this language will lead the reader to think and to act and to feel? And if we can start to actually highlight the words where we've started to do that, well, we know that we're meeting the fundamentals of this task and that we're on the right track. And once we get these things down pat, we can start to challenge ourselves to improve our analysis even further. And we can do that by doing things such as we see in these consistently good analysis paragraphs that I'm about to show you in the next phase of this video. Okay, so moving on to some of these habits of the consistently good pieces. And this is something that I feel that any student should be watching, because we're looking to move beyond the basics of the task and looking to see some of the strategies that we can employ to ensure that we're writing consistently good, effective argument analysis pieces. So take a look at this sample paragraph with me and see some of the things that perhaps you could start to bring into your own writing, be it sentence starters or sentence structures or language features or strategies about how to analyse argument that could really help you out. Members of the community are led to see themselves as not just locals, but Australians, as Astaire points out that we're already one of the biggest users of electronic payments in the world. And so right from the start, you can notice that this paragraph is talking about an approach, an argument. This area of study about 3 years ago moved to being called, using language to persuade, to argument analysis, in this area, presenting and analysing argument. But argument analysis. So we need to be able to talk about arguments. And when it comes to arguments, we can play with that a little bit and talk about the approaches or the ways in which they do these things to try and impact a reader. And so this strategy or this technique that we've seen where Astaire actually takes people to see themselves not just as locals of her town, but as Australians, and then mentions that Australians are already, one of the biggest users, is something that she has done. It's an argument. And so this is going to be the basis of this paragraph. Let's look at the way that it finds multiple forms of evidence and multiple ways that she leads a reader to think and act and feel within this umbrella of seeing themselves as Australians and not just locals. Through this, the old favourite, readers are able to see themselves as part of a larger group that is taking to electronic spending, leading them to consider their own habits and whether they are a part of the majority or whether this is something that they should perhaps adopt as others have. And so a few things there that we can notice. This idea of, readers seeing themselves as part of a bigger group. That's getting to a more insightful analysis. It's not just this idea that this language means I'll feel guilty, this language means I'll feel happy, this language means I'll feel sorry for the reader, the writer, or whatever it might be, but rather talking about, well, this is how the reader is going to begin to see themselves as part of a larger group. And then that word consider, to consider their own habits and whether they are a part of the majority. It's really getting to this insightful understanding of how the language is really going to get into the reader's head. It's not just saying, all right, it'll make them feel this, it'll make them feel that. And so you might be sitting there saying, well, haven't you always said in your videos this idea of think, act, feel? And yes, I do. That's the fundamentals. That's what it all has to come back to. But that level of what someone feels or what they think is where we can start to improve it. And so this is a really good example of where the analysis is starting to improve in its level of insight. It's going deeper because it's talking about the considerations that would go through a reader's mind as they go through some of these arguments. Let's take a look at where it goes from that. And so this next sentence, Astaire takes this point further when she describes those who will need time as the minority. And so a nice little way of just including those quotes there and embedding those quotes as part of my own language within that sentence. Those who will need time as the minority. And so we have this understanding that now she's starting to narrow in on a certain part of the audience, and we've got that direct quote about the fact that she's referred to them as the minority. Readers are provided with a clear distinction between those who pay electronically and those who have not yet caught up with the process that Astaire clearly points out as simple. Now, this sentence is really, really important because in earlier videos where we've talked about the nuts and bolts, this might be where I'd be saying, get to the think, act, feel, get to the think, act, feel. This just goes further with the sentence from before, where it's pointing out more of what the writer has done. It's already talked about, people seeing themselves in the minority, and then it's talked about, well, now that they're seeing themselves as the minority, that there's this clear distinction between those who pay electronically. And then notice how it brings up more language where it talks about others having not caught up. That's just an intelligent way of nodding to the point that you understand, like, okay, she's used those words caught up as this way of saying, well, if you're the minority, you're behind and you need to, quote, catch up. And so we haven't forgot, though, of course, that we must get to that analysis come the end of it, and that bringing it back to that think, act, and feel and the intended effect. And so it wraps up with, ultimately, such descriptions allow Astaire to depict the issue as not being a case for concern and that she is merely moving with modern trends. And so we have this understanding of argument and how it is leading the reader to think, act, or feel a certain way. I probably wouldn't mind a few more words in there that allow us to understand exactly how it impacts on the reader. But I think it's a very good understanding of how argument can work and the intended effect of the argument. It probably could be that little bit pointier in saying that, how the reader would feel as a result of that. But I think there's enough there in that way that she talks about the arguments and the way that she gets the writer to see themselves and how that's going to get them to act in a certain way based on how they might be perceiving their own behaviour. And so we have one more paragraph here because I want to show you the different ways. And as I said at the top of the video, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to writing argument analysis. And it's really about you experimenting with different things that you learn off your teachers, that you might learn off videos such as these, and finding ways that work for you. Of course, there are really great structures for you to fall back on, and perhaps your school and your teacher has taught you some of those structures, and they are excellent to making sure that you're on track. But I do want to ensure that you leave these videos understanding that there's many different ways that this can be done and that you need to start developing your own method of doing it by getting more comfortable at doing this through writing more practice pieces. And so another way that we could look at these consistently good analysis pieces is taking a look at this paragraph. Having created a sense of enthusiasm about the change, Astaire moves to portraying cash as cumbersome and awkward. And so again, we have that immediate identification of argument. A tact that has been used by Hailey Astaire is that she is going to portray cash as being cumbersome and awkward. Of course, the thing that allows this paragraph to start well is that first little part of it there where it says, having created a sense of enthusiasm about the change. So it's that way of saying, right, there was something here before that I've just talked about, Now I'm moving to this next argument. And so just referring back to the argument that you've just finished analysing can be that way of making sure you've got a really nicely threaded analysis piece where the paragraphs actually move into each other, and that you're showing this overall understanding of how the how the arguments move into each other and how they flow through the piece. Her reference to rummaging through a bag leads readers to feel the frustration of attempting to find physical coins and the nuisance that not having cash on hand can be in their lives. With this idea communicated to readers, Astaire then uses language such as breeze and simple when describing the process of electronic payments, setting up a clear distinction between the two. Through this, readers are moved to sense the hassle and inconvenience of cash in comparison to electronic payments. And one thing that I think would be really useful for you to do with those 3 or 4 sentences of analysis is to consider all the elements of what makes an analysis paragraph. And we always need to have the what the writer is doing, or the topic, or the argument, or whatever it might be, whether your school uses TEA or what, how, why, or AATE or whatever it is. Essentially, all of those acronyms come back to the idea that you need to be able to identify something that's happening, an argument. You need to provide some form of evidence of it, the language, the quote, the whatever it might be, the how they've done it. And then you need to get to why they've done it, and that idea of impact and effect and all those things on the reader. And so take a look at how it happens here, because when we're looking to write these consistently good pieces, we want to move beyond this was the argument, here's a quote that shows that argument, and then this is how it made them feel. That is going to be a really sort of rudimentary sort of structure. And if that's just repeated ad nauseum throughout your entire analysis, it's going to limit how far that analysis can be rewarded. Instead, this sort of throws them all into the blender. Her reference to rummaging through a bag, okay, so that's talking about the idea of, that's bringing up the language and giving the evidence right from the start, leads readers to feel the frustration. So we've already got the impact of language, in the way in which it's already come up. So we've got that evidence and that impact straight away of attempting to find physical coins and the nuisance that not having cash on hand can be. With this idea communicated to readers. And so this is something else that I've talked about in those other videos where we talk about the reader being moved to another point, and the idea of and the understanding of how arguments move readers to other feelings. And so that sentence starter of with this idea communicated to readers, Astaire then uses language such as breeze and simple. And so it's that idea of getting more out of the analysis. We're still talking about the idea that cash is a hassle, but I'm going to show that not just in the way where I talk about the words that she shows to show that it's a hassle, but where she starts to talk about the positive connotations around electronic payments when describing the process of electronic payments, setting up a clear distinction between the two. So again, that's only pointing out what she is doing there as a writer. She's setting up this clear distinction. Notice how then it makes sure that it moves to this last sentence to really ensure that it's got to the impact, because as important as it is for you to be able to identify the arguments and the things that the writer has done, and as important as it is to include quotes and really great things like that, what the task is really all about is about that impact on the reader. So let's take a look at this sentence as a way of seeing how it always makes sure it gets back to what's most important. Through this, readers are moved to sense the hassle and inconvenience of cash in comparison to electronic payments. So in a really basic way, it just sums up everything and gives it that sense of completion and that idea of I've noticed an argument, I've given multiple forms of evidence to show how well I've understand the difference, the differences within the argument and the nuances of language within the argument. And now I'm just summing it up with saying, look, this is the reason why she's done it. However, so now we're looking to take this even further by bringing in somewhat of a comparison to Morricone's language. And a lot of times when there are two different writers on the exam, students start to think, well, does this mean I have to write comparatively like in the SAC? And the answer technically is that, well, no, you don't have to write comparatively. That's not one of the criteria that you're being judged on. However, I still would encourage you to do so, because if you are comparing, you're probably allowing yourself to be more insightful and showing that broader understanding of argument and the difference between the two of them as well. Morricone looks to undermine this line of argument through his inclusion of a broken card reading machine. The rolls of paper piling up behind the machine act as a rebuttal to Astaire's portrayal of cash as cumbersome in comparison to card payments. The image also includes an error message, providing readers with a reminder as to the temperamental nature of technology and its capacity to malfunction. And so what we're noticing here is that the impact and that think, act, feel isn't always just some simple emotion. The reader will feel angry, the reader will feel guilty, the reader will feel sad. But rather, we can start to use terms such as providing readers with a reminder as to the temperamental nature of technology. And so it's not this basic think, act, feel, but it's still getting to, well, this is how he wanted them to feel. He wanted to remind them that, hey, technology doesn't always work seamlessly. It's not always the breeze that they talk about. Thus, so again, that word that allows us to say, all right, I've brought up all of these things. Now I'm really going to make sure that I bring it home and sum up all the ways that language has worked here. Readers are led to query the so-called better experience that Astaire speaks of and share in Morricone's skepticism. And so a few techniques that have been used there. And when I say techniques, I don't mean by the writer that we're analysing, but rather by me as the writer of this paragraph, in that some of the sentence starters are allowing me to show that understanding of argument and how it is fluid and how it moves. Making sure that I always get back to that, think, act, feel. And hopefully you're also seeing there that think, act, feel has levels of insight to it. And while the nuts and bolts, we might be about those emotions that we can just talk about. Here, when we start to get more insightful, there's things that we can talk about, frustration, the nuisance, and seeing things in two different ways, and the way things are portrayed, and how we are led to query things and remember the temperamental nature of technology, and that the impacts of those things, that when we start to rehearse these ways of doing it, we get ourselves in the habit of always looking to go deeper and to go further. And so we're going to finish off today's video with a paragraph of what I would call some of the top range analysis. And when I say that, I mean analysis that's engaging in some of the habits that the very best pieces use. And so I want to point out to you what's been done throughout this paragraph to allow it to really get to those deeper levels of insight and to allow it to be that smoother, more cohesive written analysis in and of itself. And so it goes. A sense of trepidation and unease is introduced as Morricone asks about the rush of the change before many of us are ready. And so as we read that first sentence, I want you to consider all the other ways that you could bring up the idea of Morricone asking, why now? Why rush this change? And all of those things before many of us are ready. And I want you to think about the fact that this uses two parts of the quote. That it just uses a single word, rush, and then the idea of many of us, because they are the key elements of that question that this is then going to go on and analyse. The idea of many of us, members of the community, and that the idea of rush will bring this sense of unease. And so instead of it just being, okay, there's this question, and that's what I picked up on, and Morricone uses a question, it actually begins with the impact and says a sense of trepidation and unease is introduced. That could be a way that you could lift your analysis. If you start to read through some of your practice pieces and you start to notice that a lot of the times your structure of writing is to point out the argument and then get to the impact, and then point out another argument and then get to the impact, maybe try changing it up and start with the impact. It's a way of changing up the flow of your writing and keeping your writing lively and engaging for the person reading it. And so as you can see there, instead of just saying Morricone has asked this question, it talks about the impact first and then uses parts of the question and the main parts that it needs. Looking to include the portion of the local audience who may not yet be comfortable with cashless payments, Morricone moves from this sense of skepticism to then detail the experience of his elderly mother. And so this first part of the sentence is what I want to point your attention towards, where it has the understanding that there are multiple groups within an audience, and that we don't just have to look at audience of saying, oh, well, I guess because it's a local supermarket, the audience are locals and that's all I can say. But knowing that there are groups within it, and that, Morricone is including the portion who may not yet be comfortable. And we know that those people exist because he talks about his mother being one of them. And perhaps when he says many of us aren't ready, he's probably also including himself. And so that more insightful analysis can come from you developing the habit to always look for the sections of the audience and the attitudes of the audience and how that might open you up to further analysis within it. Through this transition, readers are moved to see the impacts of such a rushed process and even consider others, including even themselves, who may be similarly affected. Morricone's use of the word eliminated conveys a sense of heavy-handedness, leading the reader to question the effects of the change upon the more vulnerable members of the community, such as Morricone's mother. And I will point out here that this is a return to that traditional sort of structure by saying Morricone's use of the word eliminated. So it starts with the thing that he's done. It then gives the language, the example of it with the quote eliminated, and then gets to the impact. And that's quite okay. It doesn't mean that that basic structure is something that you must always avoid if you're looking to write really good pieces. It means that you have the ability to use it and then to use other structures as well. But it doesn't mean going and never using that simple structure ever again. With Astaire's process now in doubt, Morricone is able to question her intentions further as he introduces an ulterior motive. Readers are thus moved to a sense of mistrust and wariness in regards to Astaire and the true intention behind her change. And so the last thing I want to point out to you with this paragraph is that it uses a technique that I've talked about before, where we can have this overall, this more holistic understanding of argument and how it shifts, and that idea that a writer will move, that a writer will move a reader or a group of readers to a certain feeling, and once they've got them there, they'll then move them somewhere else, and now that they've got them feeling that way, they can then do this. And when you start to think of argument analysis in that way, many more options are made open and available to you. You can start to think of these things in a way where you understand that language has these impacts and that language moves and that arguments shift and that tones shift and that argument can have this further impact beyond its original intention, and that once we get a certain emotion and a certain feeling amongst a reader, we can then squeeze that and go further and get them to another point. And if you have that sort of technique and that sort of strategy behind how you're going about arguing, how you're going about analysing, you're going to be able to access those deeper ideas and that deeper understanding of how argument works upon a reader. And so that's it for our video for today. I hope you've got a lot out of it. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of our content. Share it with your friends and watch it over and over again if you need to in your pursuit to improve yourself for the exam. Put your questions down the bottom. Like our video to help give us a little bit of support here on YouTube. We really appreciate that, and keep working hard. We'll see you next time.